Thank you. It's my great privilege to be here today. And I'm going to talk about a subject that kind of revisits a conversation that Preston McAfee and Tom Sargent were having. And so at Chicago, I've been exposed and elsewhere a lot to evidence-based policy. Of course, we always love evidence. We don't want to dismiss it. But I always got a little bit annoyed by the fact that somehow our policy analysis was supposed to be purely evidence-based, and that really that's kind of a false construct. That one can never think about decision-making or policy, economic policy, without also having a framework to think about it. And in many cases, the framework itself is critical to how you use the data and to the conclusions which you draw from it. Now, we've seen, throughout this conference, and including the last two presentations, some of the remarkable contributions coming from machine learning, AI, and the like. And these have been very, very good at kind of solving pattern recognition problems, certain types of prediction problems, and the like. And it's been truly impressive. And the two things have come together. One is very rich data sources, as well as convenient computer algorithms to go through and help find in order to detect patterns. This list the DataSpeak argument debate has been out there for a long time. I wrote, when I was originally writing on this subject, my colleague Steven Stigler, who's an expert in the history of statistics, of course had to expose the fact that the origins of this were much earlier than I'd even realized, and cited this quote that he has in a recent book from Alfred Marshall. The most reckless and treacherous theorist is he who professes to let facts and figures speak for themselves, who keeps in the background the part he has played, perhaps unconsciously, in selecting and grouping them. So even the data choice itself, what data you choose to look at, is part of the conceptual framework. But of course, there's more to it than that. So there was this kind of very influential work by Burns and Mitchell. And Burns and Mitchell were, in the early days, trying to look across a bunch of different time series and figure out measurements of the business cycle. And it was kind of a largely very empirical approach to this. And then Charlie Koopmans wrote this essay saying, well, that's perhaps an interesting start, but in order to get somewhere interesting, we have to go beyond this kind of measurement without theory, and that the theory part was critical to really understanding the mechanisms behind the data there. And there's several other people I could bring to bear on this debate. It says, so the question is, does this new environment put this debate off the table, or put this discussion off the table? And I absolutely believe it does not, and that's kind of what I want to be talking about here for a few minutes. So structural models. So in previous talks, we've had some references to structural, but without necessarily great definitions from my standpoint. Judea-Pearl comes at this more from a statistician's mentality, and it's not in ways that don't extend very nicely to dynamic environments, I don't think. But what do we want for structural models? What does it mean to be a structural model? Here there's a beautiful paper by Leo Hurwicz back in the 60s, who actually gave formal definitions of a structural model, and it was all about moving parts of the model and holding other parts invariant. And that in order to understand things, that those type of exercises were really important. So structural models, we use them to, quote, interpret evidence, to try to provide a more primitive interpretation. But what does that mean? Well, one way to think about it is the study of counterfactuals. What happens if we take things and want to make hypothetical modifications, and as we sometimes want to engage in policy analysis. Also, for many economists, these so-called structural models offer transparency and clarity. They open the door to bringing in evidence across different sources and trying to figure out ways in which they might be linked as well. So these structural models, in dynamic context, becomes all the more subtle and interesting in the context because the people inside our models are forward-looking. And so we just can't look at, we just don't build backward structural models typically. They have these forward-looking pieces to them involving people's perceptions about stuff. And that's kind of critical to the building of dynamic structural models. And this is the part that the kind of Judea-Pearl type analysis is just not well suited to confront. And part of what we're after here is the following. We may be situations where we've got incredible data richness, and it tells us a lot about things. And so, but the challenge here is to go from places where things are data rich to places in which there's sparsity. And so the policy analysis often pushes you to look at, well, things are rich here, but how do I extrapolate from here to here? And that's where the conceptual framework comes into play in a very, very central way. And that's really the type of conceptual underpinnings which Leo Hurwicz had. And part of this, then, is an important question. When we do these counterfactual or policy-type exercises, what are we allowed to hold invariant? So for a long time, economists like to hold preferences invariant when we change technologies or tax policies, or we might get, but these are non-trivial judgments. Sometimes people start talking about endogeneity of preferences and technologies and how technologies respond to hypothetical changes and tax policies and the like. Invariance is at the heart of structural model building, but it's also an interesting challenge to actually formally defend. Also, there's this issue about how do we weigh alternative models. So the type of models that get the most attention in economics, beyond data fitting, are ones that are often so-called highly stylized. And in the case of macroeconomics, the field that I've been exposed to, but I try to keep a little bit of a healthy distance from, we often have these people who want to influence policy. They will make very strong assertions. These assertions are based often on weak evidence and strong priors. And I think it's very important to kind of distinguish the roles of these things. And then when we have multiple models, multiple views on the table with potentially differential policy implications, how do we weight those? That they give distinct interpretations of the data, and they can give differential policy implications. So this is really also an important part of all of this, I believe. There's a recent, somewhat provocative paper about using models for policy that refers to them as quantitative storytelling. So we buy these highly stylized models. We want them to have some quantitative relevance. At the end of the day, we know they're simplifications. We know they don't capture everything, but somehow we find them useful. Perhaps storytelling is a little bit too insulting, but maybe there's some truth to it. Sometimes when I do this stuff, I do worry that I'm turned into a quantitative storyteller. So for me, in order to really confront some of these key issues, we really have to start putting the decision problem on the table. And we have to really think hard about uncertainty. In broader terms than typically that are typically discussed. I find the following kind of categorization to be useful. It's possible to blur these distinctions, but I do find them valuable conceptually. So we often talk about risk. So what does risk mean? So I think about risk as the following. I've got some model. The model has probabilities. Those probabilities then, I've got fully probabilistic specification. The outcomes are uncertain, but not the probabilities. Ambiguity. I have multiple models on the table. What weights should I assign to each one of these? How much confidence should I put on each one of these? Now this can partly be determined by historical data, but it's also prior information. Now there's this very elegant theory of subjective probabilities due to DeFinetti and to Savage. And there's no doubt this is very elegant stuff. And the Savage axiomatic system is something that is now routinely taught in many economics classes. It's, and so therefore, maybe subjective probability solves it. Basically, wherever you don't know probabilities, you just kind of, they should be revealed subjectively as part of rational decision making. But even Savage and DeFinetti, when they talked about these subjective inputs, would concede that these subjective inputs are typically only known often in fairly crude ways. And as we think about building models over higher and higher dimensions, the potential sensitivity to these priors becomes all the more important for some of the reasons that Tom Sargent was talking about. There's no notion of putting diffuse priors or priors of ignorance in very, very large spaces. They're necessarily informative, opening the door to prior sensitivity as being potentially important. And there's a third one, and this is the one that probably connects to Tom's talk, and that's misspecification. Of course, models, by their very nature, are wrong. We know they're wrong. The whole point of the model is some simplification or some abstraction. In economics, they're often especially dynamics, they're often very simplified models, and so they're not very hard to think about ways to falsify them. It doesn't take all that much cleverness, but we still believe them to be useful. So I think about misspecification as uncertainty about models. We have these approximating models. We think they're good. We think they're insightful. But how can we make sure that we're not abusing them? And so this is the hardest one. And so here's where one wants to think about putting through flexible probabilistic perturbations on things and kind of assessing the consequences. So these type of considerations affect how we pose decision problems. They affect how we deduce economic implications from those decision problems as well, both for social policy and for, say, market outcomes. So now, navigating uncertainty. So the theory of risk aversion is the theory of caution. There's a counterpart to this as we start thinking about ambiguity and misspecification. There's a whole long literature about so-called robust Bayesian methods, and that's all about prior sensitivity. So that's not a new topic. It's been out there for a while. But if you document prior sensitivity, why should you care? The only way that one can answer that is asking what you're going to use the model for. And that's where I think posing things as decision problems then becomes a very, very useful thing to be doing. If we think about model being misspecified, well, why do I care? Again, I don't know how to address that without at least asking how I'm going to use the model in some more formal way. And so the aim of these so-called robust approaches is to use models in sensible ways, still draw on the tools of statistics, and still use those type of tools in sensible ways without pretending to know without the same pretense of knowledge. Now, just like risk aversion is a theory of caution, there's, this also, one can couple this with a theory of ambiguity aversion or concerns about model misspecification as sources of caution. It would be debatable about how much how much caution you want to put inside these decision problems, but it's a useful question. Now, how does robustness come into play? Given this is a theory of caution, you start doing these sensitivity analyses. You check, you look across priors, you look at potential misspecifications, and you start asking, where in this decision problem does it really matter? And so you start focusing quantitatively on kind of places in which they really, really matter. Now, I've been applying this in the context, I'll talk a little bit later about this in a moment, climate science and economics. And whenever I do this, I start talking about we don't know everything. People think I work for the Trump administration and therefore we should do nothing. There's nothing about this. This decision theory does not say because you don't know things, you don't do anything. In fact, it's a theory of, since it's a theory of caution, and maybe even without a full set of knowledge, it may be much less costly for us to act now rather than waiting till the knowledge is revealed, and then it becomes tremendously costly. So once there's severe climate degradation, we'll start learning more about these mechanisms, but by then it's going to be very, very costly to respond. So this is not a theory of inaction. So what are the new challenges? I mean, what's with this kind of new data, these new computational algorithms out there? So to me, what they do is they open the door to the construction and assessment of potentially new models. So if I think about macroeconomics, for a long time it was responding to the national income and product accounts. Those are the basic data, and the models were kind of in some sense tailored to give so-called structural interpretations of things. As we get new models, then the role for creative research, from my standpoint, is to think about models with this economic structure that can confront these new data sets and can exploit new computational methods. Data informs model construction, and then models provide interpretive devices for data. There's a back and forth that takes place. So how to use, how to build potentially new sets of structural models in order to exploit these advances, I think, is a very interesting and important challenge. How do we ensure transparency in the construction of the application of the algorithms? One can argue this from a couple perspectives. One is more from a kind of a social policy perspective. So, so you're not blindsided by some black box. Also, from a knowledge-based perspective, transparency opens the door to critical assessment and limits the misuse of data analytic methods. So I think that's an important challenge. I think more generally, how do we provide quantitative assessments of the social cost and benefit of these new technologies? So Mike Spencer in his opening talk kind of said, talked about the multidimensional aspects of this. Mike suggested we don't touch the national income and product accounts. In some sense, I think you almost have to, because we're talking about technologies and technological advances that have impact on output and the like. So it seems to me like one has to open the door to those type of issues for sure. Just as in the past, macroeconomists went from so-called physical capital stocks measures to intangible capital stocks that required models and thinking about, and I think this does as well. So I think that's very important. And one thing I left off of this slide, but I also think is really important, is, and this is being used as well, these computational algorithms being used to find patterns in data can also be used in solving models. These dynamic models with forward-looking agents are very challenging to solve, and there's kind of a big dimensionality component to those as well. And there's been some recent work coming out of applied mathematics trying to figure out how to use neural net methods to actually solve things like PDEs and the like. And those type of methods, I think, are how to transport those methods into the model solution part, I think, can also be very, very valuable. Wang Chen also said I'm supposed to talk about climate science and economics and uncertainty. So this is, of course, like a 3-minute discussion, right? So anyway, this is something which I am working on, and the most I'll do here is advertise. We have lots of evidence for a human imprint on the environment and its potential impact on the climate. Where the uncertainty comes into play is the quantitative magnitudes of the dynamic transmission over different horizons. So we emit carbon into the atmosphere today. It's going to impact the climate, say, via temperature in future periods, in future decades. What's that impact, and how durable is that impact? Well, we know from climate scientists, it can be very durable. But those are important questions. And so here I'm quoting a paper by, it's Allen et al. The et al. Has a huge long list of climate scientists. And it's just acknowledging the fact that from their modeling situation, the global mean temperature associated with any level of greenhouse concentrations is uncertain. And this is going to complicate setting stabilization. So notice the problem here is kind of interesting in the sense of we're in a dynamic environment. We can look at past history, but what we're exploring is things that are going to push us away from where our past history is. And this requires models. It requires climate models. It requires economic models, both. So what are the measurement challenges? There's little historical experience to really draw upon here. The evidence there is weak. Impacts are likely to be different for different regions of the economy. There's potential big differences between long-run and short-run consequences because of adaptation. We don't yet have really great models of how people will adapt to changes in the underlying environment, which is tremendously important in assessing costs and benefits. Let me just see. I think I missed a slide here. Oops, I guess I didn't put it in there. I was going to show you the quantitative. So anyway, there's here I've got a picture of two prominent economists have rather different views on what potential damages are, and so these are very, very simplified notions of if you change temperature, what's our kind of proportional losses and economic welfare. I plotted out a curve here that's low damages. That's pretty much the Nordhaus type view, and these are very simplified characterizations of these damages. And then I produced this much steeper curve, which is a bit of an exaggeration over the Weitzman type view, that indeed these damages could be huge. Now the problem is we're talking about damages here over a range over which we haven't observed temperature changes, so this is all speculation. I can't just go to data and try to figure this out very easily. So this is a type of uncertainty. I've got these two different models on the table. I can start asking how to weight them. Should I go all in on one or the other? Or should I be looking at both consequences? Now here's another. This comes from a different. This is evidence from a different literature completely, and this is one that tries to look at cross-country evidence to make conjectures as what's going to happen to the overall world economy. So this is tricky business, because I'm thinking about an advanced economy like the US economy. I'm thinking about a temperature change, and I'm going to go to a more temperate economy and try to make guesses what's going to happen to the US economy. Of course, there's lots of things that could be going on here, and there's differences. And these methods try to put in fixed effects and try to control for certain country differences and the like. But this is going cross-country to try to make speculations about what's going to happen to damages. And even here, if you take the evidence as given, and in fact, these are huge impacts if you look at their consequences for policy. There's a fair, here I'm giving 20, 40, 60, and 80% quantiles coming after empirical evidence. So it's so even personally, I'm kind of skeptical about the use of this cross-country evidence, and even if you take it literally, it's not as if it it gives you the precise answer. So what I failed to show you was what came out of climate science. This uncertainty. And in fact, we're using in our research characterizations of its climate sensitivity, of how sensitive temperature changes are to changes in emissions. And we've got histograms in our work and densities for our work coming from climate sciences that show us the nature of that uncertainty, and it's non-trivial. And then what happens is, if you combine that uncertainty with this kind of damage type uncertainty, the two are kind of multiplicative, or they can be reinforcing each other. This is the mapping from temperature to reduction in welfare. Then we also have uncertainty in the mapping from human emissions today in terms of temperature, where the climate science uncertainty comes into play. To address this problem, we have to think about that interaction between the two. And as I say, there's a sense in which it's kind of multiplicative, and so I just can't add the effects together and get the right answer. So anyway, we're doing quantitative research that addresses all this, or at least trying to produce a framework to do it. So what are the measurements? Oh, I'm going the wrong direction here. Forward, backwards, whatever. Let's see. Where do we stand? So in our own work, I can't tell you what the social cost of carbon is. The Trump EPA could tell you the social cost of carbon, but I can't. I read their studies, and I couldn't quite follow them. But through sensitivity analysis, we show that the cost can increase, potentially can increase substantially by broadening notions of uncertainty. And there's no notion that we should be we should not be active. In our work, the key challenges here are we need more ambitious climate models. Climate models, the climate science literature builds very, very highly complex models. They have both a spatial and a dynamic dimensions to them. They're very, very hard numerically to solve, and we just can't stick those inside our models. We have to work with approximations, and we try to draw on research from the climate sciences to which ones are good. But this is kind of the tricky and challenging part of structural model building. What type? And so we're exploring with climate scientists to ramp up ambition here. So far, we've done the social cost of carbon, which is like the equivalent of a so-called Pigouvian tax on an externality, which is kind of a stylized calculation. But these same uncertainty concerns ought to be important for looking at policies like green energy subsidies and public funding for R&D for mitigation. Those Nordhaus and Weitzman damage functions, they kind of have adaptation just buried in the background. But adaptation seems like that could be very, very important here. So understanding or modeling the adaptation process seems critical. And while to date, learning for the climate science and the economics part has been occurring very, very slowly, that doesn't mean you should ignore learning, because you know that if you eventually get big climate effects, that's going to ramp up learning at the same time. And so we look forward to including that. So I'm getting signs here about wrapping up, so let me... Conclusions: new data and enhanced computation can open the door to construction of new models necessary for enhanced understanding. For me, asset pricing, which I didn't talk about here, but decision theory tools help in navigating through multiple components of uncertainty. And let me end with a quote from, the United States doesn't have a whole lot of great philosophers, so I picked my favorite. Mark Twain: evidence is the path from cocky ignorance to miserable uncertainty. So hopefully I've helped you think about ways to navigate through miserable uncertainty. Thank you very much.